Good morning or good afternoon to all of you, or good evening perhaps to some of you. I'm Brinton Likes, and I'm delighted to welcome you here on behalf of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice, as well as this event's co-sponsors, the Applied Developmental and Educational Psychology program at Boston College's Lynch School of Education and Human Development, and the Psychological Humanities and Ethics Initiative at the Lynch School. It's a great pleasure to welcome Gina Langhout here today. She's been a visiting scholar with us at a distance at the Center for Human Rights and International Justice this year. And she will share with us some of her decades-long research, but most recently research focused on a very timely issue that is a challenge to all of us. Just a few logistics. She will speak for about 40 minutes, after which she will be delighted to take your questions or comments, which you can submit at any time during the presentation by typing them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom. Davin Huang, a third-year doctoral student in the Applied Developmental and Educational Psychology program, will introduce Gina to you. His research interests are in understanding educational inequities that arise from school and neighborhood inequalities. Thank you, Davin, for being with us and for introducing Gina.
Thank you, Dr. Likes. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Langhout to you today. Dr. Gina Langhout is a professor of psychology at UC Santa Cruz. She received her PhD in community psychology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her work focuses on empowerment in workplace, educational, and neighborhood settings. She has published over 40 papers and book chapters on this work. In the majority of her work, Dr. Langhout uses a paradigm called participatory action research to critically examine schools and neighborhoods. She is best known for her youth participatory action research with Latinx children and has been asked to speak on this work across the Americas. Her most recent work examines violence against immigrant communities and responses that focus on solidarity and community building. Dr. Langhout is a fellow of the Society for Community Research and Action and the 2019 recipient of the Society's Special Contributions to Community Psychology Award. She will also be a keynote speaker for the 2021 conference of the International Society for Theoretical Psychology. The title of her presentation today is The Effects of Current Immigration Policies in the United States and in Santa Cruz, Understanding Violence. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Langhout.
Thank you so much, Davin. I'm going to share my screen now for the talk. Okay. And set a timer for myself. All right, so I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. The land that I am on, since I am not with you all, is on the traditional and unceded territory of the Yupi tribe of the Awaswas Nation. Today, these lands are represented by the Ama Mutsun tribal band, who are the descendants of the Awaswas and Mutsun nations, whose ancestors were taken to Mission Santa Cruz and Mission San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the central coast of California. Today, the Ama Mutsun are working hard to fulfill their obligation to the Creator to care for and steward Mother Earth and all living things through relearning efforts and through the Ama Mutsun Land Trust. I do my best to work in solidarity by questioning how Mission Santa Cruz is represented to the public and pushing for more accurate representations, working against violence in my own community, and learning about and teaching decolonial philosophies. All right, so before I get started today, I would like to give a little bit of a content warning. I will be discussing immigration raids in great detail in the second half of the talk. So I just want you to be aware of that and to do what you need to do to take care of yourselves throughout the talk. So I wanna just start out by saying that by immigrants in this talk, I'm talking about current immigrants, although this country unless you are indigenous or you were captured and enslaved and brought here. You are likely an immigrant to this country, or your family is. And what I have up here is a picture of my own family. And my family's story is that my great-great-great-grandmother was married to a man who was, in my family, the story is a very bad man. His name was Ficus Ficema. He was from the northernmost part of what is now known as Holland. And she prayed for relief from him. And within 2 weeks, he was dead. And so she brought together her 12 children and got on a ship and came to the US with no papers, no nothing, and was welcomed and was settled in, and then settled in Iowa. And so that's the way my family tells the story. And since then, I've done a little bit of research, and I've learned that when my family immigrated from Friesland, or the northern part of Holland, in the mid-1800s, what was going on is it was shortly after the Homestead Act had been passed in the US, which essentially carved up the Midwest for colonization and to turn it into farmland. And when that happened, another thing that happened was the US started trading around the world with grain and wheat and other things. And what that did is it depressed the price of wheat and other produce and products, farm products, in Holland and other places as well. And my family, they were farmers. And they essentially likely could no longer support themselves either because of these US policies. And so I just think that's important to point out, because as I read it, I was sort of surprised to see some similarities with what's happened across the Americas as well, due to US policies such as NAFTA, with like corn in Mexico and the price of corn. And so I think that that's an interesting parallel that also obviously has vast differences that are worth pointing out as well, around white privilege and around different time periods, and around welcoming in general that my family received when coming to the US. So I just like to start with situating myself in this work a little bit to make that a little bit clearer. So in this talk today, I'm going to be focusing on violence as a theoretical construction for understanding our policies and what that means across the US. So I take this from Galtung's work, who is a sociologist and a mathematician and works in the field of peace studies. And Galtung instructs us to not only think about violence in terms of direct violence, which is kind of what we are used to in the US when we think about violence, but also to consider cultural and structural violence and see how they are interrelated to one another. So direct violence, there we go. Direct violence is an event such as a killing, an ICE raid, or the detention of a social group. Like I said, the kinds of things that I think we're typically used to thinking about. Cultural violence, on the other hand, is any aspect of culture that can be used to justify violence. So examples might include language, ideology, narratives, who gets to produce knowledge, what gets counted as knowledge, and the control of public space like schools, streets, and the courts. And then finally, we have structural violence. So this is the production, maintenance, and reproduction of oppression that's usually based on social identity markers such as race, gender, immigration status, etc. So Galtung reminds us that the triangle can be oriented as standing on, a leg or a corner, resulting in 6 possible orientations. The components of violence intermingle with one another or happen together. So if we take the top left figure, for example, we might consider that sexual assault might be direct violence that happens based on the cultural violence of ideologies about masculinity and femininity, and structural of violence like few sexual assaults being prosecuted in the courts. We could also consider the top right. So here we might say that the direct violence of sexual assault and the structural violence of the pay gap can facilitate sexist jokes in the workplace, for example. And Galtung says that we tend to, focus on violence with sort of that leg at the bottom to see how usually cultural and structural violence sort of create a context for direct violence. But Galtung really wants us to think about violence in all of the different permutations here that we have. So what I'm going to do is focus on this bottom figure and think about violence against immigrants and start with the direct violence of ICE raids, detention, deportation, and see how that facilitates also cultural and structural violence in the Santa Cruz community, and then how all of that reduces community cohesion, solidarity, and mobilization, and what can be done about that. So this is essentially the outline for the talk. And if this makes you nervous, here's another way to look at the outline of the talk. So I'm going to start with direct violence. I'm going to talk about the a policy brief that I was the lead author on with many co-authors through the Society for Community Research and Action that gets into some of these issues. And then I'm going to talk about Santa Cruz and especially around what's happened in Santa Cruz around cultural and structural violence after some ICE raids. Okay, so I'm going to start with talking about direct violence through ICE raids and deportation and how this reduces community cohesion. So I want to take you back a little bit to February 2017. There were some ICE raids that happened in the Santa Cruz area. And in these raids, there were 92 Department of Homeland Security, ICE, or Homeland Security investigation agents in 2 neighborhoods, plus at least 21 Santa Cruz police. And we don't know exactly how many. The reports just say at least 21. And we know that there were many, many more people here from DHS, ICE, and HSI than the 92 who were out on the streets, because there was also support folks who were in our community. And so there was a raid that was based on a 5-year investigation. And this raid happened around 4 a.m. And the raid included the use of helicopters and flash grenades in several neighborhoods in our community here. And 10 or 12 men were arrested due to their alleged involvement with MS-13. And I say 10 or 12 because the reports vary depending on the court documents from 2017 and 2018. So I want to be clear that even the court records are not always clear. And charges were not added until August of 2018. So this is over a year later. You might ask, why can that happen? And it's because if they were holding these men for immigration related reasons, then this is a civil violation and not a criminal one. And so they have no rights to see an attorney for any kind of due process or anything of this nature. Plea bargains were entered in for 10 of the men between January and March of 2019 to 2020. So you see there's still quite a period here. And 10 of the men were sentenced between June of 2019 and November of 2020. And there are still 2 men who are awaiting trial. So you can see, again, this is a very extended time period. It's also important for me to note that there were 10 more people who were detained in the raids. And we didn't learn this until a couple of days after the raid. So maybe a day or 2 after the raids. So I want you to have this context in mind now as I talk about the context of deportation from the policy brief perspective. So current policies are that we have now are simply, even under the former administration, are this simply a ratcheting up of policy changes that occurred in the 90s under the Clinton administration, and then again in 2001 under the Bush administration. And with Clinton, what happened in the US is that we moved away from family reunification policies around immigration that had been in effect since World War II. And what these changes did is that they increased administrative authority and decreased judicial oversight. So if you're somebody who thinks that our system works best with a lot of checks and balances so that we can make sure that there's not abuse of power, this essentially takes away some of those checks and balances. So that's important to attend to. Another thing that's important to note is that the majority of people who are deported in the US have no criminal convictions. The majority of people who are deported from the interior of the US have lived here, well, the median time they have lived in the US is 14 years. So we're really talking about our long-term neighbors here. and that many have US citizen children. So we know little about the effects on the individuals who are deported. I believe that Dr. Brinton Likes is doing some work on this now, which I look forward to coming out. But we do know that many individuals return to the turbulent environments that they were often fleeing, and that many face, or that some face violence upon return to the countries that they were fleeing, and that people who have left often experience high rates of depression. We also know that we need a lot more research on the psychosocial effects on the individual so that we can really flesh out, what's going on with the individual. This work has been harder to do because we don't always know where people end up, so it's hard to follow people. We know a lot more about the effects on the family of deportation and forced family separation. I want to point out that this research does tend to focus on straight couples, and this is partially a function of heterosexist immigration laws in terms of how one can gain status in the US. So, it's important to point out that queer families have kids too, and queer families are immigrant families as well. So we do know that in terms of deportation and forced family separation, that 10% of US born children are in mixed status families. And by this, I mean that, likely one person might have citizenship or some other kind of papers, and one person doesn't have any documentation or papers. And we also know that it's mostly men who are deported. And I want to point out, by logic, when I get to the later part of the talk, in California, these numbers have to be higher since we're a border state. We know that there are negative psychosocial effects on children, and these effects tend to be psychological, physical, and educational, and you can read them here, but there are multiple effects in multiple domains that are important to attend to. We also know in terms of the family unit that unit faces economic hardship, and that when one person is deported, as I mentioned before, this research tends to focus on straight couples, and if it's usually the man who's deported, and because of sexism in our society, that person is a higher wage earner, then the family tends to lose 40 to 90% of their income, with an average being about 70% of their income. So obviously, this is going to lead to housing instability, food insecurity, and if there are older children in the household, then they often need to take on work or childcare responsibilities if there are younger children in the household. And we also know that in terms of mothers, they become single parents within just a few moments, right? Because that's how a lot of these deportations happen. That's what happened here in Santa Cruz, is that just in a matter of moments, somebody was taken, and people's lives are just turned completely upside down from that situation. So often the parent who's left behind ends up working multiple jobs. They have reduced contact with their children, and also increased fear of losing their children from this new context. And if they're still in a romantic relationship, it's usually severed. So the answer is not to deport the entire family, as research shows that children who are deported with family members suffer from extremely profound adjustment difficulties and have a strong sense of loss regarding their futures. Okay, so we also know in terms of families that those who are in the family, not even necessarily in the same household, but in the family in general, often become fearful and mistrust public institutions. So this means that this can also include things like healthcare and emergency room visits. They'll often refuse to talk with police if they are a crime victim. And this research is not just around people who are undocumented, but anybody in the family who maybe even has documentation or in the neighborhood because of fear of bringing the state essentially back into the neighborhood or into people's lives. And this also results in an increased fear of police. We know that families stop using or reduce using social health and public services. So this might look like things like not attending parent-teacher conferences, not going to the park anymore, lots of things like this, maybe not going to religious services, and civic engagement decreases, and with that social isolation increases. And this has negative mental and physical health effects as well when civic engagement decreases and social isolation increases. And these effects on the family are also often felt in the broader community. So there are widespread effects, either from being the eyewitness of a raid or hearing about it later, or being in the region where it happens, or even learning about it on social media. And we're all connected via social media these days in interesting ways. And so this means that the effects can be incredibly broad and widespread. And there hasn't been a whole lot of research to date on the long-term effects. The research that we were able to find in the for creating this policy brief, the longest term we found was about 2 years out. And here what we learned from this research is that still 2 years later, parents daily report sadness, fatigue, feeling hopeless, etc. There continue to be negative physical health outcomes, and children continue to experience negative outcomes in terms of school and psychosocial outcomes from deportation and forced family separation. So in terms of the overall policy brief then, what we did is we really talked about this as a public health crisis. And so you might ask why. So the rationale is that if we're talking about long-term community members, people who have lived in our communities for a median of 14 years, when they're suddenly removed, this just has really broad and big implications for our entire community. So we know that public resource decreases, and we know that this creates larger community level inequities when people aren't using the resources or don't feel that they can use the resources or have resources taken away from them. And with these larger community level inequities in any society, what that does is it starts to disintegrate the social fabric of the community. And when we have these situations where we have these huge inequities and where we have a disintegrated social fabric, this also weakens well-being of outcomes for the entire community, for me, for everybody. Research shows that when, for example, education levels are disparate in a community, the life expectancy is less for everyone. When there are big income gaps in a community, there are poorer mental health outcomes for everyone. So there are other examples too. The point is that community level inequality is bad for everyone. And this is a big part of what makes this a public health crisis. Okay, so I've talked us through a little bit around ICE raids and deportation and how this reduces community cohesion and has huge effects on everyone in our community, although obviously disparate effects depending on your relationship to what's happened in your positionality. So what I'm going to do next then is talk a little bit more about structural violence via percepticide, and I'll define that. And then also cultural violence versus an us versus them ideology and narratives about immigrants, and talk about how this reduces community cohesion and solidarity. Okay, so as a reminder, structural violence is the production, maintenance, and reproduction of oppression that's usually based on some kind of social identity marker like race, gender, immigration status, etc. So Diana Taylor coined the term percepticide based on her work in understanding the dirty war in Argentina. So she creates this term based on this work, yet she also says that the tactics of terror and the systematic victimization of subjugated peoples lives on throughout the globe. I therefore use percepticide as an appropriate conceptual tool for thinking about structural violence in our community. So percepticide occurs when a population is not allowed to acknowledge the violence that's taking place around it. So it's essentially a forced looking away, often through implicit collaborators. And that forced looking away can make a population silent, deaf, and blind to that violent situation that's happening around them. And as a reminder, cultural violence is any aspect of culture that can be used to justify violence. So I'm going to talk mostly about how ideology can be used toward culturally violent means and give you some examples in our community. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to read a testimonial that happened in the city council meeting that occurred the day after the ICE raids in Santa Cruz. So I just want to prepare you for that. All right, so at that meeting, basically a bunch of people showed up and demanded to talk about the raids, and the city council eventually conceded. So I attended that meeting, and then I went through later and found the transcript, or found the recording. And so I'm going to read to you a transcript, an edited transcript from a testimonial that was given in that open and public meeting. Yesterday at 4 a.m., I heard a big bomb in my complex. I live on City Avenue, and so me and my husband got up really scared because we didn't know what was happening. We looked through the window and the back court where there were we thought they were a bunch of soldiers because it was dark. We couldn't see them. They were carrying big guns. They were pointing them everywhere. So I told my husband, just get down on the floor. I don't know what's happening. They started screaming, hands up, hands up. So we just got on the floor, and then our knees. We crawled to get our kids. We have an 11-year-old boy and a 2-year-old girl, and there was a second explosion. Then the third explosion came. We heard glass windows. We heard people crying, kids crying, and people running on the streets. We didn't get out because we were scared. In the morning, around 9 a.m., I found that the apartment next to our apartment got all the windows broken. They had kids. The soldiers that I now know were ICE, they came into the apartment, and they were throwing this kind of bomb into the apartment. They have kids. They had kids. They could have died. So you can see the trauma that happened in our community from this raid that happened, you know, at 4 a.m., which is still dark in February and cold. And others gave testimonials that were similar to this. There was a lot that was shared at that meeting that was very challenging, and I'm certain very hard for the people who were sharing this information, given especially that it had happened just the day before. So there were 31 speakers on this issue. 30 spoke out against the raid. And I looked in our local paper the next day. And it's important to point out that in our community, we have one local paper. We have, you know, like TV network news media as well, but they are not located in our community. They're either in San Francisco or in Monterey. And so really, if you want to get a sense of what's happening in the local community, this one paper is the place to look typically. And so I looked at the paper the next day, and there were 2 mentions, but there was no detail given about what had actually happened, even though person after person after person gave this kind of horrific details about what actually happened. So I'm calling this structural violence via percepticide, because unless you attended that meeting or were in one of these neighborhoods that were raided or knew somebody well, you were forced to look away. You didn't know what had actually happened. So I want to talk about what was in the paper. And so what was in the paper said this essentially. Raided area resident says, now I am worried about the young people and the children who are going through this terror because I could call it terror. But we don't know why this person is saying that, right? This is like this is a conclusion. There's no description. So that is, you know, again, this form of percepticide because we don't get to see what's happening. A retired Santa Cruz County Sheriff deputy said he applauded the police department for being involved in the raids, offering a calming influence. He sympathized with stories of children who were upset by the arrests. So again, this term upset, right? So the paper chooses to give more time to the one person who spoke in favor of the raid at the meeting, even though there were 30 who spoke against it. And then, you know, this person says the children were upset. Well, I get upset if I can't find a parking place. This isn't about being upset. That's not what happened here. These families were terrorized. So even using that term is, again, a forced looking away of what actually happened. So it's not the fault of the police department, it's the gang members. Those are the people that really should be held. All right, so here we see this cultural violence of this us versus them language, right? This conflation of immigrants with gang members, and the assumption that everybody who was picked up must be a gang member, and that they're the ones who are responsible. And that is befitting of a militarized ICE raid, even if they are. Okay, so then we had our second council meeting. And between the first and the second council meeting, they happened 2 weeks apart. We found out in the community that there were these 10 additional people who were picked up as well. And so in the transcript I'm going to show you and read you, just like with this one, the underlining is consistent with the review of the literature on the policy brief. And then also anything in italics is a refutation of the violence that's being leveled against immigrant communities. Okay, so this person says during the city council meeting in the open part again, or on this agenda item, this person says, a lot of people think that just because ICE came over to the house, they think badly of us. They think we are delinquent criminals. I looked through the window and I saw ICE coming. Obviously, I felt fear. And first thing I told my son, who's 11, was to take my 5-year-old daughter and that I was going to pick up the baby and we were going to go through the back and go by and leave by the fence. I didn't want anything bad to happen and I wanted to get away from them. So what happens is that I saw ICE. They were all lined up over around by the fence and they were pointing their weapons toward the inside. I told my son, no, son, come along with me. And I thought they were pointing their weapons at us. And they didn't even know who was going to come out of the houses. And they were willing to shoot at anyone that came out. So my son started running and they saw him and they started either shooting or doing something like that. They, or ICE, were also pointing their weapon at another family and towards their back, toward his 14-year-old son's back. And they were pulling him out of the house. They threw him onto the truck so that they would search him. And they did it very aggressively, as if he was an adult or some sort of criminal that he is not. And they had him outside in the cold for over 2 hours. All this is affecting our children. I feel really bad now that my 5-year-old gets up every day and tells me, Mom, don't worry. ICE is not coming for you. Or at times she says, Mom, don't worry. I'll be taking care of you. So at the city council meeting, 28 people spoke against the raid. Again, there were many testimonials like the one that I just shared with you. But there was no mention of any testimony in the paper. So again, I'm calling this structural violence via percepticide because our local paper, again, was an implicit collaborator in the community turning away from what actually happened during this raid. So what did the paper include instead? Here's a quote. Outcry followed the roundup with much of the Latino community speaking against the fear of deportation without due process. So again, no detail, just a conclusion. For a certain resident of Santa Cruz, the roundup had merit, according to an email she sent to the Sentinel addressed to the police department. What matters is that they were caught, the resident said. It seems to me you don't care about the average citizen who lives here and has for a long time and would like to be safe. Wanting to harbor criminals seems to be more important to you than the good citizens who pay their taxes and want to live in peace and harmony. Okay, so let's talk about this for a moment. So here we see again these ideologies of us versus them, you know, talking about the quote average citizen and using that kind of language, and good citizens who pay their taxes. So we also see this sort of neoliberal definition of citizenship in terms of who's a hard worker who pays taxes. And also, you know, narratives again that conflate immigration with criminalization. And so by this point, we also know that, you know, approximately half of the people picked up were not part of the people who should have been picked up. And so we also see here that, you know, the paper, again, it doesn't report, it doesn't give any testimony or any detail from anybody who was at the meeting, but instead the paper chose to highlight material from somebody who didn't even attend the meeting, from somebody who wrote a letter to the police and then CC'd the paper. It could be that if this person had attended the meeting, they wouldn't have even written this letter. Like, we don't know, because this person never got detail about what actually happened during this raid. So again, we see this, this continual cultural and structural violence that makes community cohesion and solidarity almost impossible in our community. All right, so now we've talked through this structural and cultural violence and how this has reduced community cohesion and solidarity in general. And so now we've pretty much talked through this entire model. And so what I want to do in my remaining time is talk about how to counteract this locally and talk a little bit about the Youth Participatory Action Research Project and the youth in our program, which I'll get to in a few moments. So in terms of counteracting locally, it's important that we do some conceptual and ideological work. So we want to make the links between mass deportation and mass incarceration clear. And there's a nice segment from Democracy Now! In May 2017 about this with Michelle Alexander, you know, reminding us that the only reason that we can have a mass deportation system at this point is because it's built on a mass incarceration system. So really thinking about how what solidarity looks like and what these links look like, especially between Black communities and Latino communities and immigrant communities in general, is important. And to think about these links also in terms of other types of violence against underrepresented and misrepresented groups as a way to start to really build some solidarity. And also that we want to understand migration, especially unauthorized migration, as a form of decolonization. So this is a reference that I got from Dr. Brenton Likes a while ago. Achayumi, a UCLA law professor, makes the argument that the colonial project involved the outmigration of at least 62 million European Americans who left their home countries to colonize the rest of the world between 1800 and 1950. Through this process, resources were extracted from colonized lands and went to dominator communities. Laws were also created that benefit the colonizer. This process created a permanent power imbalance. So we need to understand global political economic migration today as an attempt to rebalance that power, which makes this migration part of the decolonial project. Achayumi defines decolonization as the pursuit of a long overdue geopolitical reordering of benefits of a global order defined by interdependence defined in the colonial era. This act of decolonization is especially the case for the unauthorized migrant, whose behavior must be understood as a political act of resistance to colonization, given global political and economic colonial structures that continue to extract resources from colonized lands. There will always be a colonial advantage given the advantages already reaped by the colonizers. So the most likely way to rebalance power is migration to the land that was taken by the colonizer. We can also engage in advocacy locally. So it's important to strengthen sanctuary policies, at least to create a context where immigrant communities feel welcome, and to move toward comprehensive immigration reform. And this is sorely needed. So according to Lee Gellerant, one of the lead attorneys for the ACLU, which brought the case of family separation at the border against the Trump administration, as of December 2020, there were still 628 children separated from their parents, and this was down from 1,000. Even after the court told the Trump administration to stop separating children from their parents, they continued to separate 1,100 to 1,200 children from their parents. The Trump administration continued to separate parents from their children if they thought the child was in danger, but it wasn't social workers who were making these determinations. It was ICE officials who likely had no training that would allow them to make such a determination. And they were separating children on the grounds that their parents crossed the border. They decided that that showed that the parent was a bad parent, or that they had a DUI 10 years ago, et cetera. The Trump administration refused to look for the parents, even though they were mandated to by the courts. This is why other groups like Justice in Motion formed to take on this work, to actually find the parents. But it's been very slow going due to the obstruction by the Trump administration, and because the contact information is often useless because the parents are separated so long ago from their children. So Lee Gellerant thinks the only reason why the administration gave more contact information to reach parents is because of public outcry, not because the courts mandated it. So now let's turn to the Biden administration. The current administration has created a task force to reunite children with their families. And as of March 1st, they reunited an additional 105 children with their families. But so far, it's unclear how much power this task force will have. Many of us are advocating for restitution, access to culturally appropriate mental health care, and a path to citizenship for these families. We don't yet know if any of this is going to be made available. And also we must acknowledge that there are approximately 15,000 kids being held in large detention centers at the border right now, and for longer than the 3 days mandated by Health and Human Services. The Biden administration has also severely restricted access to reporters. So we still have a lot of work to do on this, and simply a change of administration is just not enough, simply not enough. So there needs to be more pressure and more advocacy. So in terms of counteracting locally, in terms of direct action, if you're a bystander of street violence, intervene if you are willing and able. And iHollaback is a great place to look for, if somebody's being targeted, especially right now, with this issue also of, this longstanding issue, as well as Asian communities always being labeled as immigrants. So, and the hate crimes that are happening right now. So iHollaback is a great place to look to get some training on bystander intervention against street violence. I'm not talking about, intervening against an ICE raid, but street violence in general. And there's also a really nice webinar on the Society for Community Research and Action page as well. And I recommend pairing these. Become a legal observer if you have such an organization in your community. So legal observers are often used when there is an ICE raid to document what's happening, because oftentimes ICE is not following their own protocols. And if people in the community can document that, that can be used to stop a deportation. CopWatch runs somewhat similar in communities. And if you're not of the social group, learn about positionality and solidarity work. So in our area, we have the Catalyst Project, which is out of Oakland, and they do a lot of trainings for white allies. Surge, the Showing Up for Racial Justice, is another good organization to look to. If you have monetary resources, give to Know Your Rights organizations or Know Your Rights training, and for DACA applications right now, since DACA has been recently opened up again. A DACA application costs $495 to apply, and it lasts for 2 years. And we're still in the middle of a pandemic. This is a lot of money for a lot of families and a lot of individuals. And fundraise for bonds, emergency aid to reunite families, and also for attorneys. The number one reason a person doesn't get deported is because they can actually retain an attorney. So this is really important as well. In terms of practice, we want to participate in dangerous seeing, or seeing, this is what Diana Taylor calls it, seeing that which was not given to be seen. Seek it out and find it and make it visible to others. That's what I've done here today with this talk, is showing you and sharing with you what happened in our community, even though if you try to look these things up, it's really hard to find in any kind of news media sources. So by looking at that which was not given to be seen, we create a rupture or an opening for community cohesion, solidarity, and action. It's also important to advocate for culturally sensitive and readily available social, public, and health services, and to use a healing justice model in the work that we do. So here is a kind of a synthesis of a model that my research team and I have been using. It's a way of thinking about community well-being that brings together social justice, healing, and action. And this model is used in schools and youth programs around the country and has shown positive results in the psychological and educational literature. So here we focus on building community, assessing an issue, developing a courageous vision around that issue, taking a collective action, and reassessing and continuing to build community. So now I'm going to just briefly move into our project. I'm looking at the time. I'm not going to read to you this script, but basically the young people in our program we work with 4th and 5th grade students, so they are typically 9 to 12 years old. And they decided that what they wanted to focus on several months after these ICE raids happen in their community. The school that I connect with, they are in the school catchment area, includes 2 neighborhoods that were raided in February of 2017. So they wanted to talk about this and decided that the problem that they wanted to focus on was this. We think La Migra and the police should be held responsible for their actions. So that's why we picked this topic. We want them to be respectful. And so they picked this topic after a series of doing some photo voice exercises, a method called the 5 Whys, to really get to this issue of focusing on La Migra and their lack of accountability as being the thing that needed to change if their community was going to be more cohesive. So what they decided to do is they wanted to create a vision where everyone in the county felt welcome and was treated respectfully. And so what they decided to do from this was to create some artwork through some collective actions and through collecting some stories. And they created a documentary. And I believe somebody's going to drop a link to the documentary in the chat now so that you have access to that documentary as well. It's about a 22-minute documentary. And let me just say something about that now. The documentary, it was co-produced by youth in our program. They wrote all of the interview questions and they conducted all of the interviews, and they helped put the story together and the sequence of the story as well. So they are co-producers of that. So they wanted to do this because they wanted to rehumanize the people who were taken from our community. So these young people engage in healing justice, and with it, dangerous seeing. Indeed, dangerous seeing is necessary because to be empowered by seeing, we must decode the fictions about violence. The Change for Good children do this by talking about being in an apartment that was raided, for example, by claiming their uncle as somebody who was taken, by drawing links between this treatment and what happens day to day on the streets in their neighborhoods. They want to look and to see. And it is our duty as adults in this region to look at what they keep directing us to look at, and to create opportunities for them and our entire community to practice healing justice. And this is the artwork that they created to tell their story. They also, this was turned into many postcards and flyers and left in different places around our community as well. And I'll put this back up, but I want to show my thank you slide. And good, I'm at my time. So there are many, many people to thank in terms of this project and who made all of this work possible. I'm presenting it to you today, but there are many hands involved in this work. And with that, I will put it back to here and let you look at this for a minute, and then I'll stop sharing my screen and take questions. So thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Gina, so very much. If we were there physically, we would applaud the presentation. It was a wonderful introduction to compelling issues that are on all of our minds. I just want to encourage people to put your questions in the Q&A, as that's the route into sharing them with Gina, and also to once again say that Tim has put the link to the video, the documentary that Gina mentioned in the chat for anybody who would like to take a look at it later. So I'm going to start, since I don't see another question, Gina, and thank you first for reminding us of the variety of ways in which, once we have an analysis and an understanding of what's going on, that we can take action, and that actions in a variety of different ways in a variety of different fronts. And then the second thing that I deeply appreciate is recognizing the impact that these issues have on all of us, and the critical ways in which those of us in the dominant population, those of us who benefit from white privilege or who have other positions, benefit from this percepticide. And and that there are vehicles for challenging it, as you pointed out, in a variety of different contexts. So that takes me to a question from one of our attendees who works for a publication that shares migrant news and asks, how do you recommend encouraging migrants to share these stories respectfully and safely so that they can be broadcast more broadly?
Yeah, I think with our young people, it's, working in groups, right? Because I think a really important piece of this is that anybody who's feeling targeted, them knowing that they're not alone, and that, these stories that they have some kind of structural aspects to them. And so being able to connect to one another and being able to tell stories that really show complex personhood. So not only, what happened that was targeting, what happened that was racist, that was violent, but also what's going on in communities around healing, around resistance, or just showing resistance, and really working to point out that there are all kinds of everyday resistance. So one of my former students, who's now an assistant professor herself, Christine Rosales, is really, I think, does exquisite work around this in terms of working in communities with primarily women of color to help ask questions. So she asks questions that really help them generate all of the ways that they resist and all of the ways that they engage in community care that are just like the things that happen and not, aren't really labeled in those kinds of ways. So what she did with her project is she worked with the women to create a zine that they then distributed locally in their own community. So I would say working in groups and focusing on, all of those aspects and not only one piece of it, and then having the community come together to decide what stories they want to share. And I think through that kind of collaborative process, I think that's a respectful way to do that.
And maybe to build on that question, did you or others that work among you take up with the local newspaper its coverage, or do you see that as a waste of time and not worth the...
Yeah, this is a challenging. I did not take it right to the paper. I think it's important to also point out that our local paper, it used to be owned by a prominent family, a family that has gone into politics and has represented our area for many, many years now. And then they sold their paper a couple of years, well, now more than a couple of years, several years ago. And then whomever they sold it to then sold the paper to a hedge fund. So yeah, so a hedge fund owns our paper and it's just gutted the paper, right? There's just not enough reporters. So there are also, structural issues around that as well. And more recently, we've had a new kind of digital, I don't want to call it a daily. I don't know what to call it exactly. I think they post 1 or 2 stories a day. So they have daily content. But it's called Lookout, and they're affiliated with the Los Angeles Times, and they're in our area. So I think they've kind of identified our area as one that is, ready to be taken over by an actual paper that has enough resources. And I notice with who's working there, it's a lot of people who used to work at the paper before it got gutted. So I have subscribed to the new digital paper in hopes that they can get a foothold and do some good work and good analysis.
And then I have another question about your project with youth, and to what extent and in what ways you've been able to document what you see as the effects on this age youth of working on this Justice Healing Project. And the potential, the creativity is deeply impressive, but I'm wondering if you have a sense of, particularly for kids who come from immigrant families for whom these are direct experiences of violence.
Yeah, we have several papers, and yeah, I would say I'm happy to drop the references in the chat, but I don't think I can talk and do that at the same time. So I can tell you, let's see, we've got a paper, Danielle Kofelt is the first author on it. I'm going to go kind of like linearly, and it's in Journal of Community and Applied Social Psychology. And it's about, I mentioned it very briefly, this 5 whys exercise. And this is the idea that you start with a question like, why is this happening? And then the young people generate at least 5 reasons why it might be happening. And they can generate anything they want as long as it's true for them or somebody they know. And then once they've got 5, they go through those 5 and they pick the one that seems the most likely or the most interesting to them and turn that into a why as well. And so what we demonstrate in that paper is that it really enables young people to develop a more structural analysis through that process. So, so we definitely see that. We have another paper that is looking at the networks that young people have and their own goals. They're like self-initiated goals for themselves at school. And through engaging in the YPAR process, there's also changes in their networks. They're able to pull on different worlds of theirs to help them achieve the goals that they have for themselves in school. So they become much better. They gain a lot of skills in terms of navigation, which I think is really important. And so that paper, let's see, it's me and Charlie Collins and Erin Ellison, and that's in American Journal of Community Psychology. We have another one that's in press now in cultural diversity and ethnic minority psychology. The first author on that one is Sylvain Vaccarino Ruiz. I think I'm the third, and then David Gordon, and then me. And it's looking at, we integrated some work from Gordon Lee in terms of the 5 whys in the photo voice, and we've integrated something called social biography. And so the young people, they conducted interviews with their parents around immigration and their parents' hopes and dreams for themselves or their kids. And with that, we have a paper that documents the ways that integrating that social biography exercise in terms of the YPAR program also enabled young people to think about community as broader than only the school, and to, you know, really make these links much more broadly to the neighborhood, to the broader community. So that's a paper that is forthcoming. There are others. Those are the 3 that I can think of off the top of my head right now, though.
Thanks very much. And maybe to follow up on that question, to the extent to which, I know at some points you've had challenges working through the schools and in the schools.
Yes. Oh, let me mention one other paper that I think is important to mention, and then I'll address that. Another one is a concept mapping paper activity. So maybe what you're noticing is that I've spent a lot of time in my career so far really trying to develop tools that are useful for working with young people, because like I read Freire and I'm like, that's great, but how do I actually do it? And it's not clear to me. And I totally get that it's going to be context dependent. Nevertheless, if I can see it empirically and like concretely, it really helps me think about like other ways to do it and like what might work. So another paper is written by, I don't know who the first author is on it. It's either Angela Wen or Jessica Fernandez and me. I'm the last author on it. So it's the 3 of us. And it's in another journal. It's like a after school education kind of journal. And it's looking at a concept mapping activity and how young people, how they learn. We use some of Penny Foster Fishman's work on how to teach data analysis to young people. So how they grouped the ideas that they had come up with through their stories and their story collection through focus groups and things like of this nature. Okay, so Brenton, you wanted to talk about the challenges of working
with schools and doing this kind of activist research or youth participatory action research around controversial issues in and school contexts.
Yeah, it has been very challenging, and I think I think there are many pieces to why this is so challenging. One is our conceptualizations of childhood in this country. So, you know, we are the only country now who has not ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it's not that every country that has ratified it is actually like doing all of the things in there, but some countries that have ratified it are actually taking it seriously and think about what it means to have young people's voices involved in settings that impact and affect their lives. And so, first of all, we're in a context where, you know, children are conceptualized mostly as innocent or becoming, even though these experiences are their lives, you know, even though young children experience poverty, racism, classism, sexism, etc. So we have this kind of division that we want to keep young people innocent, even though that's like a false possibility for many and for most. So there's sort of like that layer. And then there's, you know, the layer of teachers also being overworked and not having always the training on how to support young people in this work. And not having the time. And so, yeah, we had a lot of difficulties and tensions with our school partner around this, and ended up needing to move the project to another community space that was about 2 blocks away from the school in order to continue it, because the school just felt like they couldn't support something that was this big. And we talked with their young people, do you want to change the topic or do you want to keep this topic and move? And they said the topic was really important to them, and it was more important to them to keep the topic than to keep meeting at the school space.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions. Davin, did you want to add a question, or are you all set?
I guess one question I have, could you talk a little bit about, in the participatory action research with youth, how do you approach developing relationships with them and engaging with them in a way that kind of privileges their voice and allows them to comfortably share it?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a couple of things that I do and that my team does. So with our team, we always start all of our YPAR programs with an icebreaker. And sometimes the icebreaker is chosen by the young people, sometimes by us. If it's a new YPAR program, then typically we'll, you know, start them out. And I always, and our team, we participate in the icebreakers. So we want to kind of break down the idea of like, who's the adult and who's the kid and who participates. So, you know, they pick like this game I'd never heard of called Graveyard. It seems like a ridiculous game to me, but I'll just mention it because I don't think many adults would play it. So you basically just like lay on the ground, and if the person who's the watch keeper sees you move, then you're like out, right? So, but there's like times when you're supposed to move around. So I just get down on the ground and roll around with everybody else. That's why I say I'm not sure a lot of adults would do it. So part of it is just, you know, like changing the role relationships among people. And maybe that's all of what I try to focus on, is changing these role relationships around like who's the knower, who's the person learning. And so I also try to engage in what I call radical listening. So like an example is we had a middle school YPAR project at one point, and the youth were engaged in Photo Voice. And we had this group of boys who just, I'm not sure why they were coming because it's not like they were like engaging a whole lot. And one day we were talking about like their photos and like what it meant in our community. And this one boy, he's like, started talking about how, well, there's just zombies in our community. You know, I see zombies and monsters. And I said to him, well, are you telling me that there are people in your community who don't feel like they belong? And this kid got like super serious like that. He went from the joker in the room to like super, super serious. He looked me straight in the eye and he's like, yes, actually, that is a problem that we have here. And then we were able to open up and have a whole different conversation, because I just try to listen for like, even if like, kids are always communicating something. Everybody's always communicating something. Can I try to discern and decipher what is being communicated if it's being told to me in a way that's not, you know, like the quote school way? And so, you know, I've had fourth graders as well look at me and say like, oh, you're actually listening to me, right? So I think it just means like taking kids seriously also, and taking their ideas seriously and trying to pick up on them and move with them.
So now I think, taking off from Davin's question, there's a question from someone very enthusiastic about your presentation with great gratitude, but asking whether or not you have any ideas of how to change the minds of adults.
Yeah, this is a big one, and it's actually a project that we're starting here locally now. And yeah, I think it has to be a lot of capacity building. And I think when adults see kids working in ways that they're really, when kids are really adept, that is probably the best thing to change their minds. But that also means working with young people a lot so that they're ready and they're prepared to be adept, you know? So our young people, they learn how to run focus groups. They run the focus groups. We might have 1 or 2 people in the room with them as sort of like a backup, but they're the ones running the focus groups. They're the ones taking the notes, but we work with them for months before they actually run a focus group, because the worst thing you can do is put a group of kids who aren't adequately prepared in front of adults, because then it's just going to reify these stereotypes. So I'm starting up a project now with 2 of my colleagues, Rebecca London in sociology and Steve McKay in sociology. And it's a partnership with United Way. And in our community, our United Way, they're a convener of after school programs. And a lot of the, well, maybe almost all of the after school programs in our region are youth serving. They're not about developing youth leadership. And the United Way would like to start to shift this into a youth leadership model. And so we're working now with sort of the youth workers around these different sites to start developing capacity so that they can start to shift their relationships with the young people in their program as well. So, you know, invite me back again in 3 years and I'll maybe have something more to say about it. But in terms of what I've seen happen at the school that we were at, you know, there was a 5th grader who a teacher wanted to hold back, and the principal had seen, or a 4th grader, I'm sorry, a 4th grader who the principal wanted to hold back, not the principal, a 4th grader who the teacher wanted to hold back. And the principal had seen the 4th grader in our after school program and was like, no, this kid, they know what they're doing, and passed him, you know, promoted him on to 5th grade. So I think a lot of it is, yeah, just making sure kids are prepared, and then having them interact with adults in ways that adults can actually see what they're capable of.
Thank you. And there's one, I think we have time for one final question. And this one is a follow-up on the issue of whether or not the youth engaged with the project differently when it moved out of the school space. And the questioner goes on, I'm wondering if the context shift may have changed how they connect with the work. For example, would doing the work within school spaces feel more restrictive in some way? They don't have as strong of a connection with school versus other community spaces?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a great hypothesis. I think there were like confounding factors in some sense when we moved, because it became harder for a lot of the kids to get to the space, even though, you know, so what we did is we had a meeting with the parents and said, like, this is what the kids want to focus on. This is what your kids want to focus on. We realize that this is, like, you know, a challenging topic and one that might not feel safe for you. So if you don't want them to focus on this, then, you know, we should stop. But if you do want them to focus on this and us to focus on this, then we need to find a new location. And, you know, we had done a little bit of work to find a couple of different locations. One was a church. It wasn't nearby, but we knew that a church is considered a sanctuary, and ICE is not supposed to enter churches. But they said that they wanted a place that was closer by because not all of them had cars and they needed to be able to pick up their kids after school. So, you know, I think that there may have been an opportunity for kind of a broader conversation, but a lot of, you know, the groundwork for this direction that they went in was laid when they were at the school. So there's definitely a difference. We had a teacher collaborator. I think there's a difference from when she was in the room versus when she wasn't in terms of what they were willing to share. But young people our young people were really adept at knowing, like, when to speak in English and when to speak in Spanish, and, you know, just like knowing what to say in front of whom. So I think that they still found ways to do the work that they wanted to do, even when we were in the confines of the school.
So Gina, our time has run out, but I just want to thank you again for taking the time, for being with us, and particularly for framing issues that are so prevalent and so pushing against us right now in a variety of different contexts, and helping us to think about creative ways as psychologists, as lawyers, as citizen activists, we can respond to them. And also to invite all of you to our next session, which will also continue on the issue of immigration and deportation, but from the perspective of the right to remain, that is, those people who decide not to migrate. We focus a lot on the right to migrate coming from countries in the global South, and this one will focus with a filmmaker, Luis Argueta, Guatemalan filmmaker, on the 30th of this month. So thank you, Davin. Thank you, Gina, very much, and many applauses.